Hello and welcome to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, Director of Advanced Media Production at Cal State Long Beach. Today we're going to talk about the international legal issues which are impacting or otherwise affecting world trade. My guest today is Cameron Roberts. He is attorney with the law firm Roberts and Kehagiaras, LLP. Welcome, Cameron, and thank you for joining us on Talking Points.
Thank you for having me. I appreciate it.
Well, let's talk about the supply chain in the wake of the pandemic. Some people are calling it post-pandemic era, but there's still a little bit of pandemic left in the supply chain. So what, in your opinion, are some of the continuing bottlenecks or barriers that still exist because of COVID-19?
Well, I think the pandemic has opened up a virtual Pandora's box of problems for people throughout the supply chain, starting with the origin suppliers and the continuing shortage, to your point, about semiconductors and some of the other vital parts that are still lagging a little bit in our supply chain. One thing that comes to mind is certainly the dramatic decrease in the amount of cargo that is coming through the ports. And this is causing strains with the ILWU, causing issues at our ports. We have a tremendous number of empties that are available and flooding back into the system, causing a congestion of empties, if you will, which was 180 degrees from where we were this time last year, when everybody was still quite concerned about empties. Actually, it was a little bit before that, probably around December, and whether or not they were going to be able to get their goods to market. So we're seeing an ongoing adjustment to the supply chain. The supply chain, I think, was designed over the last 30 years in a very different way than it's currently existing, because people were used to a predictable sort of world where we had really allowed ourselves to flatten the curve, because for many, many years, the fourth quarter was always referred to as peak. And we were able to really somewhat reduce that by creating a just-in-time system, and that's now we're adjusting to anything but.
Right. Well, you're an attorney that works in the cargo and trade arena, and your clients come to you with concerns and you help resolve those concerns. So what are some of the biggest concerns that your clients come to you about, and how do you help them resolve those issues?
Sure. Well, the cocktail party answers, we help anybody with issues from factory floor to retail door or any other point that they want to get to the ultimate consumer. So what we've seen is a big interest, of course, in managing duty because of this incredible spike in duty, driven largely by the Trump administration in the first bit, then also the increased use of anti-dumping and countervailing duty to sort of level the playing field. That's an ongoing concern because it has a retroactive effect. We also have compliance issues with forced labor that many of our clients are talking to us about, trying to predict how that's going to impact their supply chain, how they manage that and create greater transparency. And then, of course, meeting ongoing expectations of delivering the goods without having a lot of storage, demurrage, per diem. These are all big ticket items, so that drives their interest in talking to counsel about it, because the dollars at issue justify the investment.
So when you're talking about duties, you're talking about customs duties or tariff-related duties, fees, basically, that importers have to pay because of where products are originating from. And I know China is one of the countries that we have really, I hate to use the word targeted, but we have targeted China for a lot of these customs duties and tariffs and so forth. Now, one of the issues that's part of this is what's known as transshipment and client states. Now, we're going to need to define what that means in terms of transshipment with the client states, but basically it means you have a country of origin which has a heavy tariff placed upon it, such as China, and so China is going to try to move those parts that they're manufacturing into another country, a third party or third country, such as, for example, Vietnam, and then there might be some small value added aspect to that product, and then it's stamped made in Vietnam and then goes to the US. Well, so if the customs folks are on their toes and really analyzing this and tracing this down, they might realize the true country of origin is China, and then the duties will be imposed. So the client state is Vietnam, the transshipment is happening in Vietnam, where they take it off the Chinese ship, do whatever they do to it, put it back on another ship, and then send it off to the US. So a lot of what we're doing has to do with that particular aspect of trade right now. So what are some of the concerns that your importers are concerned with in that arena?
Well, first, making sure that the country of origin that they're agreeing to purchase is accurate and true. And this goes back to fair and free trade. I mean, we want to go to a supplier in, Malaysia, Vietnam, Indonesia, and we want to be able to source legitimate product as part of the decoupling from the Chinese economy. That's really one of the principal goals of the last two administrations anyway, is to create an incentive by having higher duty rates and to require, or not require, but certainly induce people to move to another country of manufacturing. This kind of, diversification, I think, is good and healthy for the overall world economy because it creates good jobs in these other countries, as well as eliminates the dependency on any one state. And what we've seen, unfortunately, is rather than creating those good jobs in other countries that will help Malaysia, help Indonesia, Vietnam, and whatnot, they're more of a sort of, this, to your point, the transshipment, where it comes in one door, very little is done to it, and then it's shipped back out, claiming to have undergone a substantial transformation. And that's just not the case. We don't have enough wholly grown or regional input from that particular place, whether it's Malaysia, Vietnam, and what have you, to say it's made there.
Mm-hmm. And so basically this is what we call a cat and mouse game of China playing the mouse in this case, in this scenario that we're talking about. And I guess the cat would be the inspectors who catch these things when they arrive on shore. So the inspectors working for the U.S. government and of course the Customs Office. So bottom line is you have had importers that have been caught up in this, I assume.
Oh, yes.
And what happens when those products are caught that have been deemed coming through a client state?
Well, first, Customs has a lot of data that it can sort through. As a result of 9/11, we instituted the ISF, which is Importer Security Filings. And so we have a lot of data that's coming from these origin countries, along with the databases that we were getting through the AMS, which is Automated Manifest System, plus what we put into the ACE system, which is another acronym. The government loves acronyms. Maybe we all do. And the ACE environment is the automated commercial environment where we put all the data in for the customs entry. These databases all combined, and the government monitors them in an effort to identify our trade statistics, but also spot anomalies and things that just don't look right. Like, why is there, so much more bedroom furniture coming from Vietnam in such a short period of time? There's no way that could have happened without transshipping. So what they'll do is they'll issue a request for information, and that's normally where we get involved, because now they're looking for a very robust set of facts and documentation and evidence, if you will, to support the contention that it was made in Malaysia. So you'll need to get everything from electricity records or purchasing records of the hardwood or the lumber or the tools, the dyes, the machinery, the workers, records for the labor that was put in. So all of the inputs that would normally be associated with manufacturing will be part of a request from the importer to the seller. And if you've got a good seller and you've got a legitimate seller, you'll be able to support that. More often than not, though, it's troubling and hard to get that information from the foreign supplier.
So in the in the case that the documentation isn't cutting the mustard, as they say, are we looking at significant duties and fines as a result?
Not fines, not so much, but definitely an increase in the amount of duty, because originally the goods were imported with the country of origin, Malaysia, and it'll be adjusted to a different country of origin, perhaps China. It might fall within an anti-dumping case, within the scope of an anti-dumping case, or within a diversion case. All of these would increase the landed cost, the amount of money that you have to spend in order to bring the goods into the country. And it will oftentimes result in people changing suppliers, altering their purchasing habits, again, which is something of the overall policy goal.
And one of the tariff rules is the 301. That's the 301 regulation. And the 301 is focused on China for many of the products that they've done there. Briefly explain, we've just about 2 minutes now before the break. So what is the 301 tariff regulation and how does it work and how are we applying it today?
Well, the 301 is a trade program that, or a law that allowed the President of the United States to enact certain tariffs in conjunction with the USTR. Leitzinger was head of that at the time, and they decided that it was China's anti-competitive behavior that justified the application of a series of tariffs being associated with a number of goods. So you had basically 1 through 4A being assessed over time in an effort to basically bring the Chinese into compliance with the U.S. Trade Representative's expectations. And within each one of those, you'd have a group of commodities, maybe electronics. It covers a very broad spectrum of commodities. So that's really what it's all about. And it was a ratcheting up, if you will, and it went from a relatively low percentage of 10% to 15 and ended up at 25. And there's still things that are at the lower, but at the same time, we have an ongoing assessment of these. So that's really the program in a nutshell.
We have another one. We only have a minute now before the break, and so we're going to talk about another tariff regulation, the 232. It's called 232, and it refers to aluminum and steel imports. And I know that when this first was enacted, there was conflict with Canada over this. And it was also at a kind of an awkward time because we were trying to push through the USMCA, which is the update of NAFTA, which incorporates the North American trade relationship. So now we have 30 seconds because I just used up 30 right there. So in 30 seconds, how are we doing with 232 and have we worked things out with Canada?
I think Canadian trade relations are much better. On the other hand, 232s and similar legislation have been the gateway for aluminum regulation over Russia and other countries. So you'll see that to continue because I think we're in a concern about our military buildup right now, and aluminum is a big part of that.
All right, and on that note, we will have to go to the break. When we come back from the break, we'll continue this conversation about some of the international legal hurdles that exist in trade today. Stay tuned.
Victor deployed for the first time to Afghanistan in 2003. At 4 in the morning, my phone rang. They said, "I regret to inform you that your husband was wounded in action." Victor sustained a moderate traumatic brain injury. I was doing school full-time, and I was also then caring for Victor. One of the most important elements of caregiving is taking care of yourself. I just didn't want to forget that I also had goals and that I also had a life. What I did is I challenged Victor to meet me halfway. He asked all his therapists to help him undertake some of the house chores. There are almost 6 million military and veteran caregivers across the nation. We have our own journey, and we can fulfill that journey at the same time that we are helping our loved one.
Visit aarp.org/caregiving for a free military veterans guide to navigate your caregiving journey.
Welcome back to Talking Points. I'm Dave Kelly, and my guest today is Cameron Roberts. We're talking about international trade and the legal issues involved with trade. Now, Cameron, we were talking earlier about various tariff regulations and so on, and so if we talk about the complication of the supply chain today, the world's very interconnected, And that's why you have Boeing, a manufacturer of large aircraft, involving as many as 16 different countries in the manufacturing process to supply parts for the assembly of these large aircraft, and also 9 different languages being spoken among those 16 countries. So that is an indication of how complicated it really is. Now, so if Boeing is on a deadline, as all companies are, to produce these aircraft, and they need these parts from these various countries, and they have to source from countries that are under these high tariff regulations, what are their options? Do they have to pay the higher tariffs and just absorb the cost or pass it along to their eventual customers? Or can they apply for waivers or some kind of exclusion? How does that work?
Well, obviously Boeing as a company is a very sophisticated enterprise, and they have a lot of in-house expertise. One of the benefits that they can avail themselves to is monitoring those valuations as they bring the goods in and controlling the flow of those goods and how they're valued, especially if they're creating subsidiaries overseas to bring those goods in. So you'll see a lot of variations in the approach to auditing, and one of the things that our firm does is help people audit their supply chain and their costing of goods so that they can get the lowest possible valuation as the goods flow through their related party supply chain. And their related party simply means that they have some interest in the overseas manufacturer where they've done a joint venture or something of that nature. You also see people being very interested in duty drawback. Duty drawback was a sleepy little part of customs for many years, but when you export something, either through launching it, for example, as Boeing does in a satellite sense, when you put something into Earth's orbit, that's an exportation out of the United States. Similarly, when you sell an airplane to a foreign country where that is now going to be domiciled in that foreign country, you can now claim duty drawback up to 99% of the amount of duty that you've paid. So these programs have become of much bigger interest to our client base, as well as just to any sophisticated enterprise that's recognizing that we may be bringing in parts, we may be assembling something, we may then be exporting that to another place. So we want to capture that duty that we paid here and bring it back in.
Mm-hmm. And because of all of these concerns about duties and tariffs, and also the reliability of the supply chain, which is really the main issue, everyone wants reliability. And it is complicated if you're sourcing from, as we said, 16 different countries. So that's led people to talk about what's now referred to as nearshoring or onshoring. Onshoring means you would bring the production and manufacturing from offshore, which is over in Asia often, and bring it back into the United States, whereas nearshoring is as close to the US as possible. So in this case, we typically set up manufacturing in Mexico because it's so close, and it is part of the USMCA, as we talked about in the first segment. So this nearshoring that we're doing now with Mexico, and I know there's a lot of automotive production that's underway in Mexico, for example, but parts for various things. So is this very similar to what we did with the Maquiladora program about 30 years ago, where we set up a whole series of manufacturing operations really close to the US border, but just on the other side? Or is it a little bit different these days?
I think you're going to see continued reliance on that Maquiladora model. I think because of the ability to move goods in and out of Mexico for certain benefits that they can give us with lower labor costs. That is going to be a continuing opportunity, but I think you're going to see even more development of industry in South and Central America, and you'll see continued interest in growing our free trade agreements to the South, especially in countries like Brazil, Peru, Argentina, Uruguay, Colombia. I think all of these places we're going to see a continued interest in developing their economies so that they can become reliable suppliers to the United States. This is again more about diversifying, but as we've talked, if you look at the issues of trade, and while the internet has helped create something of a flat earth in a way, you still have time zone considerations. You still have language considerations, you still have legal considerations. And so the ability to make a deal and enforce the deal and keep your supplier accountable is becoming harder and harder in certain parts of the world. Nearshoring gives you more leverage, gives you more abilities to work with your suppliers in real time, and I think will ultimately be beneficial to our ongoing economic needs.
Well, another aspect of international law and how labor is supplied for manufacturing in various countries is also subject to certain kinds of regulations that we pass here in the United States. And I'm thinking right now of the forced labor in the Uyghur region of China, and we actually have an act which is all about the forced labor and prevention of forced labor from China. So tell us about that a little bit. What is the UFLPA? UFLPA.
Yeah.
What is that, and how does it apply today?
Well, right now it's in its infancy. It's a relatively new program, but Customs has gotten a lot of budget allocation for that, for enforcement. What you're going to see is a tracing back of the imported merchandise here in the United States, again following back to the place of manufacture, and they're going to look at the component parts of that manufacturing. Obviously, the manufacturing could be taking place in that Uyghur region within those specific zip codes, but also our suppliers supplying subcomponents, parts, raw materials, and in certain industries, for example, in the cotton industry, which was really at the very beginning of this, the harvesting of cotton by Uyghur labor is considered to be forced labor. And so you're going to be hitting that sort of benchmark right away if you're making sheets or wearing apparel or some other finished product in Shenzhen or in Shanghai or Ningbo or some other place where you'll have the manufacturing facility, but they're using the raw materials or the yarns or the what have you that will cause the good to be investigated by Customs for UFLPA compliance. And what is or is not is difficult to know because Customs has been reluctant to share with us what is the standard. How do you prove the negative? And that's always a troubling thing. And I think that if you look at other places on the globe, specifically South America, Central America, the forced labor issues are not as prevalent as if you look at Eurasia, and you look at the subcontinent. That's a troubling trend down there because of the concept of forced labor will include indentured servitude. And this is a common practice in Pakistan and in parts of India.
And just to clarify, the UFLPA stands for Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act. So that's
right.
What we've been talking about. Let's move on to Russia now. Because of the war in Ukraine, we've imposed sanctions on Russia as well. Now, one of the problems with that today is that as we impose sanctions on Russia, Russia drew closer to China and also has brought India somewhat into the fold as well in terms of energy and energy arrangements. We know that Iran is moving in that direction toward China and Russia and India. And then now Saudi Arabia seems to be putting distance between itself and the United States and moving more toward that alliance. And there's word now that South Africa might be moving more toward that particular alliance. So we're now talking about a Eurasian alliance versus a Western alliance, essentially. And so would that Eurasian alliance, as it develops, make it more difficult for those Western sanctions against Russia to really stick and to really hurt?
Well, I think that the United States government is certainly trying to mitigate that to the greatest extent possible. There's an informal, not really an alliance structure per se, but certainly an informal understanding between the petroleum-based countries and countries that need petroleum. In particular, China and India are large consumers of petroleum. And Russia, in particular, is looking to markets for its petroleum, looking for dollars, or in the case of China, yuan, so that they can continue their war efforts in the Ukraine. I think it's going to be a challenge for the U.S. to put trade barriers between those countries in the same way that the Western NATO countries have bound together. You've recently seen the joining of Finland, which is a great asset to NATO, and you're going to see continued development, I think, of trade barriers as we understand how to enforce them more rigorously. And for example, the country of smelting has recently been enacted, I believe 2 days ago. That's now going to affect the importation and the amount of duty you pay, and you're going to have a reporting requirement that's coming up in the next 30 days as well for that same issue. So we're seeing the government drill down into the sanctions that are existing, the new sanctions that were recently announced at the beginning of the year, and we're going to see a continuing press in an effort to choke off Russia's war-making effort until the Ukrainian war, the war in Ukraine has been resolved, however that comes out.
Right, and so we're down to just a couple minutes now before we have to close the program. Let's move on now to environmental regulations and how that's going to affect the international community. I know that in California we're leading the way with climate change actions, regulations, laws, and so forth. And so what happens in the ports here in Southern California or even in Northern California is as a result of this very concerted effort to address climate change and to try to eliminate the use of fossil fuels. Now, that Eurasian Alliance, you just mentioned that they're all about fossil fuels there, and that's one of the reasons for that strengthening alliance there between Russia, China, India, and so forth. So if we have regulations here that are environmentally related, are they going to be difficult, again, to make stick if we have a whole nother alliance that we're trading with that doesn't really want to go along with that anti-fossil fuel type of sentiment? And we only have a minute left.
I think the big question is how will the East Coast ports exploit that opportunity? There's going to be a lot of tension between East Coast development and creating new ports of entry and better ports of entry for goods made in Asia as compared to California. You're already seeing a diminishing slice of the pie in the ports of Los Angeles and Long Beach. So we're going to hope that the regulations are reasonable and allow the economy and the technology to keep pace with the expectations of the political bodies and the political will that exist. Otherwise, we're going to have a problem increasing our infrastructure and keeping up with other ports.
And on that note, Cameron, we have to bring the program to a close, but I want to thank you for being here today.
It's been my pleasure.
And thank you for joining us for this edition of Talking Points. Be sure to join us again soon for the next episode. Until then, I'm Dave Kelly. Have a nice day.